On the morning of October 19th, 2021, a search party, working the ridgelines above Baldwin, Michigan, recovered a single item from a stand of old pines 4 miles past the nearest logging road. It was a compact video camera, still zipped inside its case, still holding a partial charge. The man who had carried it into those woods was gone. His name was Elwood Foss, 61 years old, a former surveyor who had lived alone at the edge of the Manistee National Forest for the better part of 19 years. He had walked into the trees on the night of October 14th on a bet, telling the men at the bar that he was going to record himself talking to the Dogman. The camera held 41 still images and no video. Lake County Sheriff Vera Hutch signed the case, closed 11 days later. Cause listed as misadventure, presumed death by exposure. The images were logged into evidence and never released. What follows is drawn from that case file, from the search records, and from the people in Baldwin who knew Elwood Foss and heard him make his last claim out loud. This is what they remember. There is a bar on the north end of Baldwin called the Cedar Tap. It is the kind of place that keeps the same 40 regulars for 30 years, and for most of 2 decades, one of those regulars was Elwood Foss. He came in most nights around 7, took the stool nearest the window, and drank slowly. The bartender, a heavyset man named Bram, who had poured for him since the early days, said Foss was quiet about everything in his life except one subject. On that one subject, he could not be stopped. Foss believed there was a dogman living in the deep forest north of town. He did not believe it the way a man believes a good story. He believed it the way a man believes in weather. He had files. He had maps with pins in them. He had a notebook, brown and swollen with damp, that he carried in his coat and set on the bar like a Bible when the talking started. Nobody in Baldwin could say exactly when Foss had gone from a private man to a man with a mission. Delia, who waited tables at the Cedar Tap for 20 years, thought it started with something he saw while surveying a parcel out past the Pere Marquette in the late 90s. He never described it the same way twice. Some nights it was a shape crossing a 2-track in his headlights. Some nights it was a sound from the tree line while he was setting a boundary pin. A sound, he said, was not a coyote and not a man, and not anything he could put in his report. But she remembered that after that season he stopped taking the deep woods jobs and he started reading. What he read over the years was everything. He knew the old Ojibwe accounts of a creature that walked upright with the head of a wolf. He knew the newspaper stories that ran every so often out of Wexford and Manistee counties. The ones about the tall thing seen crossing a road at dusk, gone before the driver could turn the car around. He collected them. He cross-referenced them. He kept a wall in his cabin. Delia had heard, papered floor to ceiling with clippings and hand-drawn maps and colored string running pin to pin, and he would sit in front of it in the evenings the way other men watch television. He would spread the clippings across the bar and tap them one by one and say that the sightings were not random, that they clustered, that a man who paid attention could learn where the thing moved and when. He described it the same way to anyone who would sit still. He said the dogman stood between 7 and 8 feet tall and walked on 2 legs like a man. He said it had the long snout and the pointed ears of a wolf and the shoulders of something far heavier than a wolf, muscled and human in the way it carried its arms. He said the back legs bent wrong, bent the way a dog's legs bend, and that it moved on them faster than anything with that much weight should move. He said the fur was dark and matted, and that it smelled from a distance like a wet dog left too long in a closed room. He said the eyes caught light and threw it back green, low to the ground when it crouched, and higher than a man's head when it stood. And that once you had seen those eyes, you never mistook a deer for anything again. Most of the men at the Cedar Tap enjoyed him the way you enjoy a fire in the corner. Warm, harmless, always going. They bought him drinks to keep him talking. They asked him questions they thought were clever. They asked him why nobody had ever shot one, and he said, because it knew what a gun was. They asked him why it had never killed anybody, and he would go quiet at that one and say that maybe it had, and that the woods up north were full of men who went in and did not come out, and that nobody ever thought to count them together. There was one man at the Cedar Tap who did not laugh, and his name does not appear in the sheriff's file because he would not give it. Delia called him the Trapper. He ran a line of coyote sets up in the same country Foss walked, and he came into the bar maybe 4 times a year. and he would sit at the far end and drink and say nothing while Foss talked. But once, late, after Foss had gone home, the trapper told Delia and Bram a story of his own. He said that 2 winters back, he had lost a whole line of sets in a single night, 11 traps, and that he had gone up to check them, and found them pulled from the ground, chain and stake and all, and hung in the branches of a single pine, 20 feet up, out of any reach, arranged around the trunk in a spiral. He said the snow under that tree had been packed flat in a wide circle, and there was 1 track in it, only one, before the wind took the rest. And it was the shape of a bare foot, longer than his snowshoe. He said he pulled the rest of his line the next morning and had not run traps in that country since. And that he came into the cedar tap to hear Foss talk, not because he thought the old man was crazy, but because he was the only other person in the county who seemed to know the woods up there were not empty. Then the trapper finished his drink and left, and Delia said she never saw him again after Foss went missing. Foss had a habit that the regulars found funny and that Delia, looking back, found the hardest thing to think about. He left it food. He told them this openly. He said he had been walking the same routes into the forest for years and leaving offerings, deer he found on the roads, fish, a haunch of pork he bought from the grocery in town, and that he left them in the same places every time, so the thing would learn the pattern. He said an animal that could learn a pattern could learn a man, and a man it had learned was a man it would not fear. And a man it did not fear was a man it might one day let close enough to talk to. He said all of this the way another man might describe feeding a stray cat off his back porch. The regulars laughed. Judd Landry, a propane driver who came in on Fridays, laughed hardest of all, and it was Judd who finally pushed Foss into the woods. But before the bet, there was one more season of it, and the people who were there say that in his last year Foss changed. He came in less. When he came in, he was tired, and there was dirt worked deep into his hands that would not wash out. And he said the offerings were disappearing faster than they had before. He said he was finding things now on his roots, things left for him. And when Bram asked what he meant, he said stacked stones and twists of grass tied in knots. And once a whole ring of small bones laid out around one of his feeding places in a circle as neat as a clock face. He said it was answering him. He said it was leaving him signs the way he left it food, and that the conversation had already started, and all that was left was to be there in person when it decided to finish it. Bram said he stopped finding Foss funny around then. He started finding him a little frightening, and he did not know if he was frightened of the woods or frightened for the man. The bet happened on a Friday in early October, and by every account it was Judd who started it. He had heard the Dogman speech 100 times, and this time he leaned back and asked Foss why. If he knew so much, he had never once gone out there and gotten proof. Foss said he had been out there plenty. Judd said he meant real proof, the kind you could show a man, and not a notebook full of scribbles. The bar went quiet enough that Delia remembered the moment years later. She said Foss did not get angry, which surprised her because Judd had gone for the soft place. Foss just closed his notebook and said something that she never forgot. He said he did not need proof because he already knew how to talk to it. He said he had spent 19 years teaching it his smell and his walk and his voice, and that it knew him now. And that, if he wanted to, he could walk out into the deep timber and record himself having a conversation with the Dogman, and bring the recording back, and then they could all stop laughing. Judd laughed anyway. He put $50 on the bar and said he would like to see that. 2 other men matched it, and the pile grew, and somebody in the back called out that they would throw in another 50 if Foss came back missing a leg. Foss looked at the money for a while, and then he took a napkin and wrote a date on it and slid it under the pile of bills, and said he would go in on the 14th and be back by the 17th with the recording. He shook Judd's hand. Bram, behind the bar, said he had never seen the man so calm and so certain, and that it was the calm that stayed with him afterward, not the claim. The claim was ridiculous. The calm was not. A man who's bluffing gets loud. Foss got quiet, and he finished his drink, and he went home to pack. Elwood Foss came into the cedar tap one more time on the evening of the 14th, wearing his coat and carrying a pack. He did not sit down. He set the camera on the bar so everyone could see it. A small silver thing he had bought new for the occasion, and he told them the plan. He would walk his oldest route north to a place he called the Calling Ground, and he would make camp. And on the second night, he would go the last distance alone and turn the camera on and speak to it the way he always had. And this time it would answer where the lens could see. He told Bram to hold the bet money behind the bar until he got back. Dahlia asked him, half joking and half not, what he would do if it did not want to talk. He smiled at her. He said it had been waiting 19 years for him to stop being afraid, and that he had finally stopped, and that a thing does not wait that long for a conversation. It means to end badly. Then he lifted a hand to the room and walked out into the dark, and that was the last time anyone in Baldwin saw him alive. The 17th came and went. Foss did not come back. Bram was not worried at first, because Foss knew the woods better than any man in the county and had stayed out longer before. But the 18th passed, and then the morning of the 19th, and Dahlia finally called the sheriff's office because nobody else would. The search was assigned to Deputy Nathaniel Ostby, a 9-year veteran of the Lake County Sheriff's Office who had grown up hunting the same forest Foss had vanished into. Ostby's incident notes form the spine of what is known about the days that followed. He was a careful writer, and he was not a man given to imagination, and it is worth saying that everything strange in this account comes from the pen of a man who did not believe in strange things. Ostby started at Foss's cabin. It was neat and cold and long empty. The wall Dahlia had described was real. It covered the whole of one side of the main room, and it was worse in person than in the telling, because up close a man could see how much work had gone into it, how many hundreds of hours, how the pins and the string traced routes that all bent toward the same empty circle in the northeast corner of the map. On the kitchen table he found the brown notebook left behind and a hand-drawn map with a route marked in pencil, heading due north and then bending northeast into a section of national forest that the deputy knew to be some of the most remote in the lower peninsula. The last pencil mark on the map was a small circle drawn around a low ridge above a creek, with a single word written beside it. Ostby recorded the word in his notes, without comment. The word was here. The notebook he read that night, before the search, and he wrote in his own report that he wished he had not. Most of it was ordinary, dates and weather and the locations of the feeding places. But the last 20 pages changed. The handwriting got smaller and more crowded. Foss had begun keeping a tally of the signs he said he was receiving, the stacked stones and the knotted grass and the bone rings, and beside each one he had written what he believed it meant. And the meanings grew steadily, less like a man cataloging an animal, and more like a man reading letters from a friend. The final entry, dated the 12th, 2 days before he went in, was a single line. It said only that it had left him a gift at the calling ground and that it was time. They set out at first light with 2 tracking dogs and a volunteer named Landry, the same Judd Landry who had made the bet, who had insisted on coming and who was, by the deputy's account, no longer laughing. The first 2 miles were ordinary. Foss had left a clear trail, boot prints in the soft ground, a snapped branch here and there, where a man had pushed through. The dogs took the scent easily and pulled ahead, and for a while it felt like a routine recovery of a stubborn old man who had twisted an ankle and holed up somewhere to wait for help. The ground began to change around the 3rd mile. The deputy noted it first as a feeling and then as a fact. The forest went quiet. Not the ordinary quiet of a still day, but a total absence of birds, of squirrels, of the small constant motion that a lifetime in the woods teaches a man to stop noticing. Ostby wrote that he found himself listening for something and not knowing what. The dogs felt it too. They stopped pulling. They began to walk close to the handler's legs, tails low, and they would not range ahead the way tracking dogs are trained to do. The first feeding place was where Foss's map said it would be, in a hollow beside a fallen oak, and it told the deputy something he did not like. The ground there was packed hard and bare in a wide flat circle, packed the way earth gets packed, under something that stands in the same spot over and over across years. At the center of it was the pork haunch Foss had described buying in town, or what was left of it, and it had not been eaten so much as opened. The bone cracked lengthwise in a way that Ostby wrote no coyote and no bear does, cracked clean as if in a vice, the marrow scooped out. Around the edge of the bare circle, pressed into the dirt at intervals, were the first of the prints. He measured them and photographed them and moved on, because a man was missing, but he wrote that he checked his sidearm at the feeding place without deciding to the way a man touches his pocket to know his keys are there. Then they started finding the marks. The next was a tree, a mature beech, with the bark stripped in 4 long parallel grooves that ran from above the deputy's head down to his waist. He had seen bear claw marks all his life. These were spaced wider than any bear he had ever tracked, and they were higher. And the wood inside the grooves was old and grey, which meant they had been made long before Foss ever walked this way. And it was not one tree. As they went on, he began to see them everywhere, the same 4 grooves at the same impossible height, tree after tree, always at the edge of the trail, as though something had marked the boundary of its ground the way a man marks a fence line. Landry wanted to turn back at the beaches. Osby wrote that he talked him out of it, and that he was not entirely sure why he had, except that the boot prints kept going and a man was still missing. Half a mile on, they came to the first of the structures. Ostby had no other word for it, so he called it a structure. It was a lattice of saplings, some as thick as a man's arm, bent and twisted and woven together into a rough dome the size of a small shed. The saplings were living wood, still rooted, bent without breaking, which no wind does and no man does easily. Inside it, hanging from the woven roof on strips of what looked like bark cordage, were bones, small ones, from deer and raccoon and things the deputy could not identify, tied up and arranged with what he described in his notes as deliberate care. It did not look like a nest. It looked, he wrote, like a room. The dogs would not go inside it. One of them began to shake, and it did not stop shaking for the rest of the day. Beyond the structure, the trail dropped toward a low wet flat, and it was in the middle of that flat that they came on the deer. It was a mature buck, and it was dead, and it was up in a tree. It had been carried or thrown into the crotch of a big maple, a full 12 feet off the ground, and wedged there. And the deputy stood under it, looking up for a long time before he wrote in his notes what he was seeing, because it did not make sense. The animal was whole. Nothing had eaten it. It had simply been killed and lifted and put where nothing on the ground could reach it, the way a man hangs a deer to keep it from coyotes. Except that no man had been within 4 miles of that maple, and no man could have put a full-grown buck up into it. The neck was broken and turned nearly all the way around. Landry would not look at it. The handler kept the dogs moving. Ostby measured the height of the crotch and photographed the deer from 4 angles, and wrote a single line under the last measurement, that whatever had put it there was tall enough to reach 12 feet and strong enough not to strain doing it. Past the deer, the trail crossed a stretch of open hardwood, and it was there, in a bed of fallen leaves, that they found the ring of stones. It was exactly what Foss had described in his notebook, a circle of small stones laid out on the ground as neat as a clock face. And inside the circle, laid with care, was a folding knife. Landry recognized it. It was Foss's. He had seen the old man use it 100 times to cut the tape off propane fittings. It was sitting in the middle of the ring, closed, clean, placed there deliberately, and the sight of it did something to Judd Landry that the deputy did not put fully into words, except to write that the man sat down in the leaves and would not get up for several minutes and kept saying that Foss never went anywhere without that knife. The trail changed after the knife. The prints were harder to follow now because Foss had begun, in his last day, to walk strangely. The stride shortened. The prints turned in circles in one clearing, doubling back on themselves, as though the man had stood for a long time, turning to face something on every side, and they were not alone anymore. In the soft ground, the deputy began to find the second set of tracks running alongside the first wide-splayed prints that came and went, that appeared beside Foss's boot prints for 30 or 40 feet, and then vanished onto hard ground and reappeared farther on, always keeping pace, always to the same side, the way a dog walks a man home. Ostby photographed them and measured them and wrote the measurements in the file. The largest was nearly 18 inches. There was no stride length that made sense for a thing that size moving that fast. They found the smell before they found the next sign. The handler noticed it first, and then all of them had it. A thick musk rolling downhill through the still air, the wet dog reek Foss had always described, strong enough that one of the dogs began to gag. It hung in a low draw they had to cross, and it was worst at the bottom. And at the bottom, driven into the mud of a seep, were prints so deep and so fresh that water was still standing in them. Fresh, made that day. Ostby stopped the group there, and they stood a long time in the reeking air and listened. And the deputy wrote that he had the clear and unshakable sense, standing in that draw, that they were being watched from the slope above, and that the smell was not a trail the animal had left behind, but the animal itself, close, waiting to see what they would do. Nothing moved. After a while, they climbed out the far side, and the smell fell away behind them, and none of them spoke of it, though the deputy noted that Landry had begun to cry without seeming to know he was doing it. There was one more thing before the sound, and Ostby set it down in his notes plainly, and then never spoke of it again. In a small clearing at the foot of the last ridge, they found where Foss had made his final camp. It was not much. A cold fire ring, a ground sheet, the pack itself lying open on its side with the contents spilled across the moss. But the contents were what stopped the deputy. Foss had laid them out. His spare socks, his knife sheath, a folded map, a tin of matches, the small tools and comforts a man carries into the woods, and he had arranged them in a neat row on the ground sheet, in order of size. The way the deputy had seen the man's own belongings arranged on the stone, he would find the next morning. It was as if Foss had spent his last evening in that clearing, copying the thing he had been shown, learning its grammar, answering in kind. And driven into the earth at the head of the ground sheet, upright, was a stick, as long as a man's arm, with a bird's skull fixed to the top of it. And the deputy did not know, and would not guess whether the old man had made it, or whether it had been left standing there for him to find. He photographed the camp. He collected nothing. He wrote that it was the moment on the whole search when he first understood, against everything he believed, that Foss had not been talking to himself out here across all those years, and that the conversation had gone on far longer and far further than any of them at the bar had ever let themselves think. It was in the last hour of light, with the group strung out and tired, and the storm building in the west, that they heard it. The handler stopped first, and then all of them, standing still in the grey timber. It came from somewhere ahead and above them on the ridge, and Ostby wrote that he had spent his whole life in those woods, and had a name for every sound a Michigan forest makes, and that this was not any of them. It started low, a long-drawn note that he could feel in his chest more than hear, and it climbed. And at the top of it there was something that was almost a word and almost a howl, and was neither, a sound with a shape to it. A sound that seemed to be trying to be speech and failing, and it went on far longer than any breathing animal should have been able to hold it. And then, from lower down the ridge and off to the side, a second one answered. The two of them called back and forth across the failing light 3 times and then stopped, and the silence after was worse than the sound. Landry said, quietly, that it had sounded like something learning to talk. Nobody answered him. The deputy wrote in his notes that in 9 years of service it was the only time he had drawn his weapon in the field without a target, and that he had stood there with it in his hand, feeling foolish and afraid in equal measure, and that he had not holstered it again until they made camp. By full dusk, they had gone nearly 4 miles, and the light was almost gone under the canopy. The dogs had stopped tracking altogether. They sat, both of them, at the base of a slope, and would not climb it. And the handler said he had worked those animals for 6 years, and had never seen them refuse ground. It was Ostby who went up the slope alone, and it was Ostby who found the camera. It was sitting upright on a flat stone at the top of the ridge, zipped into its case, placed there the way a man places something he means to come back for. The stone itself was one of the feeding places, the last one on Foss's map, the calling ground, and the deputy knew it because the ground around it was packed hard and bare in the same wide circle, and because, arranged on the flat top of the stone beside the camera, laid out with care, was a row of objects that did not belong to any animal. A button, a boundary pin, of the kind a surveyor drives to mark a corner, rusted with age. A strip of red flagging tape. Small things, a man's things. Things Foss had carried into the woods across 19 years and left behind. And something had gathered them up and set them out in a row on the stone, like a child arranging treasures. Or like a creature returning to a man, everything it knew of him. There was no sign of Foss. The deputy carried the camera down, and they made the decision to camp, because full dark in that place, with a storm coming, was not survivable for men who could not see, and in the morning they powered the camera on. There was no video on it. Foss had come all that way to make a recording, and there was not 1 second of footage. What there was photographs. 41 of them, taken over what the timestamps showed to be a period of about 90 minutes on the night of the 16th. The first images were ordinary. Trees at dusk, the creek, the ridge, a man's thumb across the corner of the lens. Then they changed. The light in them went wrong, blown out and grainy, the way a photograph goes when the flash fires at something too close or too far. In several of them there was a shape at the edge of the frame that the eye wanted to resolve, and could not, a darkness that was darker than the trees around it, and stood upright and was, in each successive frame, closer than it had been in the one before. In two of the middle frames there were points of light, low and paired, catching the flash and throwing it back the way Foss had always said the eyes did. And in one of those the paired lights were high, higher than a standing man, and angled down. The deputy's notes on the images are brief and careful. He wrote that in the last clear frame the shape filled most of the picture, and that it was too tall, and that above the shoulders there was something long that he did not describe further. The final 6 photographs were black, or nearly black, as though the camera had been pointed at the ground or held against a body. And in the last one, timestamped 2:14 in the morning, there was a pale smear across the bottom of the frame that might have been a hand. That was all the camera had. It had recorded no sound because Foss had never turned on the video.
Whatever conversation he had gone in to have, he had not, in the end, been able to press the button.
He had raised the camera and taken picture after picture of the thing coming closer, 41 times, as though he could not put it down. As though taking the picture was the only thing his hands still knew how to do. They found the rest in the morning, past the ridge, in a shallow draw. The dogs still would not enter. There was a torn strap from Foss's pack. There was one of his boots, the laces still tied, sitting alone in the leaves as though he had stepped straight up out of it. And there was a long trough dug into the forest floor, a drag mark. The earth and the moss and the small plants scored away in a line that ran 40 feet from the lip of the draw into the thick timber where the ground rose and the trail simply ended. On either side of the trough, spaced far apart and driven deep, were the same broad splayed prints the deputy had photographed at the creek, but only on one side of the mark, as if whatever made the trough had walked upright and dragged its weight along beside it with a single arm. He followed the drag mark to where it stopped. It stopped at the base of a slope thick with laurel, and there was no way through the laurel that a man could have been pulled, and no man on the far side, and no sound but the wind starting up ahead of the storm. Above the point where the mark ended, in the low branches, hung another twist of grass, knotted the way Foss had described in his notebook, fresh and green. And the deputy did not write down what he thought it meant. He only wrote that it was there. Deputy Ostby stood at the end of the drag mark for a long time, by his own account, and then he turned around and led his men out of the forest. The dogs went first and went fast. Nobody spoke on the way down. When they reached the trucks, Judd Landry sat on the tailgate and did not say anything for an hour. And then he asked the deputy what he was going to write, and the deputy said he was going to write what he could prove. What he could prove was that Elwood Foss had walked into the Manistee National Forest on the night of October 14th, 2021, and had not walked out. Sheriff Vera Hutch reviewed the file. She noted the structures and the prints and the claw marks and the camera, and she wrote, correctly, that none of it proved the presence of any animal not native to Michigan. Claw marks can be old. Bent saplings can be wind or ice. Large prints in soft mud spread and distort in the days after they are made. A drag mark can be made by a bear moving a kill, and the disappearance of a 61-year-old man in remote country in October, with a storm coming, is sadly not rare. Men die in those woods every few years. Foss was old, and he had gone in alone, and he had gone in at night, and the simplest explanation for a missing old man is not a monster, but the cold. The photographs, she wrote, were inconclusive. The case was closed as a presumed death by exposure and misadventure, and the file was placed in a drawer, and the camera with its 41 images was logged into evidence, where it remains. Deputy Ostby left the sheriff's office the following spring. He does not give interviews about the case. The one thing he is known to have said to another deputy, off the record, was that he agreed with every line the sheriff had written, that all of it was true, that none of it proved anything. And then he said that being unable to prove a thing was not the same as it not being there, and that he had gone back and read the last page of Foss's notebook a second time. the line about the gift at the calling ground, and that he thought about the row of a man's small belongings laid out on that stone, gathered and returned, and that he had come to believe Foss had been right about one thing. It had learned him. Across 19 years of pork haunches and boundary pins, it had learned the shape of the man the way you learn a shape you intend to keep. Foss had thought that meant it wanted to talk. Ostby was not sure the two things were as different to a creature like that as a man would need them to be. The bet money sat behind the bar at the Cedar Tap for almost a year. Bram would not give it back to the men who had put it down, and he would not spend it, and eventually he took it off the shelf and nobody knows what he did with it. Delia still works there. She will tell the story if you ask, and she tells it the same way every time, which is not how Foss told his. At the end of it, she always says the same thing, that Elwood Foss spent 19 years telling everybody he knew how to talk to the Dogman, and that maybe the terrible part is not that he was wrong. Maybe the terrible part is that he was right, and it came when he called, and it had never once meant to talk. The forest north of Baldwin is still there. The structures, if they were structures, have long since fallen back into the ground. The camera is in a drawer in the Lake County evidence room, and the last photograph on it is time-stamped 2:14 in the morning. And no one who has seen it will say what the pale smear at the bottom of the frame is. Only that they do not like to think about a man raising a camera to his eye one last time, in the dark, 4 miles from any road, to take a picture of the friend he had made. Real or fake, you decide.